Hi, everyone. Um, Let me start by thanking Ali for the invitation to give this lecture about data-driven policy evaluation. And in particular, today I'm going to be talking about the sufficient statistics method, which I believe is the cutting-edge method to evaluate policy based on data and economic theory. So let me start with motivation, which is the fact that databases are becoming widely available across the globe. And that's because governments are more open to these evaluations these days. So I'll show you some examples about that across the globe. And also because computation capacity has increased in the recent years so that computers and researchers, therefore, are able to evaluate these policies in a more effective way. So the policy evaluation is also increasingly common. So you see that policymakers across the globe are also more concerned into determining what's causality versus correlation. So what's just like an association between a policy and a particular outcome, and what's an actual causal effect of the policy into these outcomes of interest. And then the other thing that has been happening is that because of these preoccupations, policymakers are conducting experiments. And whenever you conduct an experiment, because you randomize individuals into treatment and control groups, you're really able to see what's the causal effect of this policy instead of just looking at the association between a policy and a particular outcome. And the last point is that even though there is this concern regarding these ideas, sometimes even though you are able to see the causal effect of a policy, you're still not able to get a clear conclusion from that study. And to make that point, I wanted to start with an example from Pakistan. And this is by a paper by Clavin and Wassam in the QGE. And in Pakistan, what I'm going to be talking about in Pakistan is the income tax. So in this graph, I'm plotting income in the horizontal axis and then the income tax in the vertical axis. And there are a couple of features of this income tax schedule. The first one is, as expected, the income tax is progressive in the sense that if you're a richer person, if you have more income, you're going to pay more income taxes. But the second feature is that there is a discontinuity in the income tax at around 600,000 rupees, which is the currency in Pakistan. So if you earn 599,999 rupees, you're going to pay substantially less taxes than if you earn 600,000 rupees. So there's a big jump around 600,000. And what you would expect is that a schedule like this would create a lot of incentives for taxpayers to report income below the 600,000 value. So Clavin and Wassam investigated this with the data. So this graph here is showing the taxable income again in the horizontal axis and the number of taxpayers on each one of those income values in the vertical axis. And you see here that a lot of taxpayers punch around the 600, exactly around the 600,000 rupees, suggesting that there is like this bunching indicates that taxpayers are adjusting their income in order to respond to the tax. So there is a causal effect, right? Like this income tax schedule is causing people to locate themselves in a particular point in the schedule. But then the point is that, does that mean that the government should decrease the income tax in Pakistan? And the point here is that not necessarily, because the government may need more revenues because it needs to invest in education, health, and so on and so forth. And because of that, what really needs to be done is for the government to redesign the income tax schedule without decreasing its revenues. But that, just like this empirical analysis, doesn't address this issue. So what public economics methods provide is guidelines based on data. So I'm going to be talking about this method today. And so the plan is to start a little bit, discussing a little bit the government objectives, which is something that we really need to establish in order to talk about what's the optimal policy for a particular country. And then we're going to discuss some rationality assumptions, which are in the core of economic theory and also of those methods. Once I've talked about those 2 points, I'm going to talk about the optimal Okay, sorry about that. So the first criteria is the utilitarian criteria, in which the government is simply maximizing the welfare or utility of individuals in an economy. The second criteria is the quality of opportunity, which says that regardless of the circumstances, all individuals should have the same opportunity. The third one, which is a little bit less common, is the quality of sacrifice, which says that everyone should put the same effort in society. So we are going to be focusing a lot in the utilitarian criteria here. And so I just want to highlight some advantages and disadvantages of it. The big advantage of it is that it's the most studied, and it also presents some ideological flexibility that I'm going to be discussing in the next graph, in the next slide. The second one, but the disadvantages of the utilitarian criteria is that first, it doesn't determine the precise level of redistribution, exactly because it has this ideological flexibility. And the second one is that it doesn't address an important point. So I think for a lot of us, equality of opportunity is something important that we care, but the utilitarian criteria doesn't address that. It just talks about redistribution and not about equality of opportunity. So to understand that, let me start with the taxpayer problem. So like, let's imagine there's a taxpayer, and the problem that it's trying to solve is that it's trying to choose how much to work, how much to consume, and how much income to report to the government to maximize its utility or welfare, subject to its own budget constraint. So mathematically, we would write that this household is maximizing its utility U, which is a function of consumption C, and the hours of work H, subject to the budget constraint that says its consumption cannot be larger than its income, which is just its hourly wage times the number of hours that this taxpayer works, minus the income tax, which is just this T here. It's a function of the income that the taxpayer earns, right? So that's basically, once again, the hourly wage times the number of hours of work. Given that problem, there are three rationality assumptions. The first one is that utility increases with consumption, right? The more you consume, the happier you are. The more money you have, the happier you are. The second one is that the marginal utility decreases with consumption. So that's saying that the more consumption you have, the less your utility is going to increase. So the idea is that, let's say like you're consuming chocolate, right? The first piece of chocolate that you eat makes you a lot happier because you're really craving for it. The second one, it still makes you happier, but a little bit less because you already got some chocolate. By the time you're eating like the 10th piece, that's not making you happy at all because you're already like very satisfied, and probably that's not increasing your utility anymore. That's the second assumption. So you see that the first and the second assumptions, they're quite intuitive, and there's not that much problem with them. The third assumption is one that is trickier, which says that the taxpayer makes its choices to maximize its utility. So like the taxpayer is really solving this problem in its mind whenever it's choosing how much consumption and hours to work. And we're going to go back to this assumption in the end of the lecture and see how we can relax it. But for now, let's stick with it. So given those assumptions and those formulas, the welfare of a society is going to be the sum of the utility of all taxpayers, which is pretty much what we said, the utility of consumption and hours, multiplied by a weight. And this weight here is what I'm calling a welfare weight given to each individual in society. Now, let me pause here. Well, before I talk about the weight, which is something important, I want to talk about the second element in this welfare function, which is the budget of the government. So the budget of the government is basically how much taxes the government is collecting from this income tax, right? And that's just the sum of all the taxes that the government collects from each individual, which is this, right? The income tax, which is a function of the income of each individual, as we saw before. Now let's talk a little bit about this welfare weight. The welfare weight is basically how much the government values each individual. But that's kind of like a philosophical question. So let me just tell you a little bit of the two broad views that economists have about this. So on one side of the spectrum, and I would say that that's kind of like the right-wing side, there is this vision from Bentham that everyone in society should have the exact same weight. So this would be the same weight for everyone. But in the other side of the spectrum, Rawls, another philosopher, says that all the weight should be given to the poorest person in society, because we really care about the poor, because the poor is a disadvantage, and so on and so forth. Now, there are two observations I wanted to make about this. The first is that even in Bentham, according to Bentham's criteria, there would be some redistribution, and that's precisely because of the decreasing marginal utility. So the idea is that if you give a $1 to a poor person that lives in the streets, that $1 is going to increase this person's utility by a lot. But if you give $1 to Bill Gates, that $1 is not going to increase his utility at all, because he's already so rich and so satisfied with money. So because of that, because this increasing utility is higher for the poor, even if you value the poor person exactly how you value Bill Gates, you still want to make some redistribution from Bill Gates to the poor because of this decreasing marginal utility. Now, the second observation that I want to make about this is that even the Rawls criteria, it does not equate to everyone's utility, right? Everyone's income, I'm sorry. And that's because even if you value only the poorest person in society, if you increase the tax too much on the rich, at some point that tax is going to increase so much that the rich is going to reduce so much its hours of work that increasing the tax actually decreases the budget of the government to a point that the government's going to have less money to transfer to the poor, even though the government's increasing the tax. So the interesting thing about the utilitarian criteria is that even though there is this ideological flexibility, the answer to the question of the optimal policy is going to be always between something like a communism in which everyone earns the same, and like a savage capitalism where there's no income taxes and no distribution in the government. Even in the extremes, both of those extremes are within these two worlds, right? Okay, so I'm going to start now talking a lot about how to solve this optimal policy in terms of income tax rate. So in terms of motivation, I wanted to mention that the motivation for the income tax is to raise revenue with the lowest possible welfare cost. The idea is that because the income tax can target different individuals in different ways, you can raise income, you can raise revenue for the government without targeting the poor, which have the highest marginal utility. So the trade-off is that an increase in the tax rate discourage income reports, right? As we saw, like as we thought about, if you increase the tax rate, individuals are likely to report less income, which decreases the government revenue, right? Because people are reporting less income, they're paying less income tax. The second point is that the second effect is that it decreases the taxpayer utility, right? People are less happy whenever they have to pay more income taxes. And it also mechanically increases the government revenue, right? Because obviously once you increase the tax rate from 10% to 20%, the government is getting more revenue mechanically from that policy. So let's look at this graph, which is plotting the tax rate in the horizontal axis and the welfare in the vertical axis. So you see here that if the tax rate is equal to 0, as you increase the tax rate, welfare is going to increase, because if the tax rate is equal to 0, the government has no money. So getting a little bit of money and increasing the tax rate, it's going to allow the government to build the first schools, the first hospitals, and that's going to increase welfare. And as you increase the tax rate, the government gets more hospitals, more schools, and that's great for everyone. But up to a point in which if the government's already going to have a lot of schools and hospitals, so that if you increase the tax rate, people don't need that many schools and hospitals anymore. So that the main effect of increasing the tax rate up to this, after this point, is going to be that taxpayers are going to get pissed that they're paying too much taxes, and then welfare is going to start decreasing, because the added value of having a government with higher taxes is lower than the cost of these higher taxes, and then welfare is going to start decreasing. And the optimal tax rate is going to happen at this point, where the function of welfare than the maximum, right? And that's exactly what we, Saez, which is an economist in Berkeley, shows that can be written as a function of three elements. The first one is the income distribution. So that's something that we observe in administrative data sets. The second one are welfare weights, which are these philosophical parameters that depends on your vision of the world or how much a poor person is valued with respect to a rich person. And the third one is the changes in income the changes in income because of the tax rate. So basically the question here that we're trying to answer to get at number 3 is how much people are gonna decrease their reported income because the tax rate has increased. So once again, going back to this graph that we saw in Pakistan, I don't want to get into the details, but basically this graph once again is showing the taxable income in Pakistan in the horizontal axis and the number of taxpayers in the vertical axis. And what these authors show is that the amount of bunching at that particular point of the schedule reveals that the elasticity of taxable income is equal to 0.5. So that basically says that if you increase that marginal tax rate by 1%, individuals in Pakistan are reducing their income by 0.5%. That's what this elasticity is saying. Now, what Saez shows in his paper is that the optimal tax rate can be written as a function of this formula, which looks very complicated. But what I wanted to highlight here is that this formula depends on a couple of parameters. So the first one is this G bar here, which is how much we value a dollar given to an individual at the top income group. So basically, like in this Rawls vision of the world that we don't care about the rich, this G bar would be 0, right? Like we have put no weight into this like top income earners. But it could be a number like greater than 0 if you think that we should put some weight, some philosophical weights on them. The second parameter is the average reported income at the top income group. So in the US, for instance, the top income group starts at people that earn more than $400,000 a year. So if you look at these people's income and get the average, that would be RM here. So that's an empirical number that we can calculate looking at the data. The second parameter is the minimum reported income in the top income group. So in the US, this number is $400,000. The fourth parameter is the taxable income elasticity, which we just saw from the previous graph. There is around 0.5. And the last parameter is something that we call the income effect parameter. I don't want to get into the details of this, but if you've taken the microeconomics course, the basic one, this is trying to get, whereas the taxable income elasticity is trying to get at the substitution effect, the income effect parameter will be trying to get at the income effect. So applying this formula to the US using US data, Emmanuel Saez finds the top income tax rate, the optimal income tax rate should fall between 43 and 50%, depending on how much you value these rich people, right? And the marginal tax rate over $400,000 increased after this paper from 35% to 39.6% in 2013. So you see that this is a cool case in which I think economic theory and data has influenced policy in the US in recent years. Now, there are some limitations to these methods. The first one is that it does not consider dynamics. And the second one is that it doesn't consider other taxes, such as consumption tax and so on. But the third limitation of this method is something more subtle. And it's the fact that we do not recover the parameters in the optimum. So let me just try to give you a sense of what this problem means. So mathematically, once again, we have like the welfare function is a function of tax rate, and we saw that it has this formula here. It has this form, which is increasing in the beginning, and then it starts decreasing, and the optimal tax rate is here at the top where welfare is maximized, right? And mathematically, for those of you that have taken calculus, the way we calculate this is just by writing down the welfare function and taking the first order condition. And then we get the point in the function that the slope is flat, and we write this formula. But if you see here, what really matters at the top is this elasticity, this income effect parameter, and this income distribution under the optimal tax rate, right? Which in the US we saw that is something like 45%. But the point here is that in practice, what we recover is just this elasticity, this income effect parameter, and this income distribution under the observed tax rate, which is much lower. In the US, we saw that it was like around 35% whenever Sias wrote this paper. So it is a little bit tricky because we actually don't recover the parameters that we actually need to compute the optimal tax rate. So taxpayers are not always rational. And so that's the third problem. The last problem is that taxpayers are not always rational. There's a lot of evidence that whenever people are thinking of how much to work and how much to consume, they're not thinking, oh, how I'm going to maximize my utility given my budget constraints. Sometimes people are not even aware of how much income taxes they will pay if they increase their income by $10,000 or if they decrease their income by $10,000. So they're not always super rational making this calculation as economists are assuming they're making whenever we're writing these models. So let me talk a little bit about a welfare analysis, which is a little different. The welfare analysis, instead of trying to get at the optimal tax rate, is just going to try to see of what happens with welfare if we have like a small reform around the observed schedule. So the motivation and we're going to do that based on transfer programs to the poor. And the motivation for this policy is that we want to maximize welfare, right? So, and the best way to do that is giving money to poor people because they like giving $1 to poor people, as you saw, increases their utility so much that it's going to be great for welfare. Now, the trade-off here is that increasing the transfer discourage income reports, increasing the cost of the program. So the idea is that if you give a lot of money to the poor, everyone is gonna try to be a little bit poorer to get this money from the government, and this is going to increase even more the cost of the program because you're going to have more poor people into the program. The second problem of increasing the transfer is that it mechanically increases the cost of the program, right? Because if you're giving like $10,000 instead of $5,000 to these poor people, you're increasing per person $5,000 in the cost of the program. The third problem is, but the trade-off is that this increase in the transfer actually increases the utility of the poor, and that's great. So you can write the welfare function of this policy in a similar way to what we did for the income tax. But here I'm plotting in the horizontal axis the transfer to the poor, which I'm just going to call B. And the welfare function is going to be W. And once again, the transfer to the poor is going to be, like if you think about a country without any transfer, giving a little bit of transfer to the poor is going to be great for welfare because you're making these poor people very happy, right? And as you increase this transfer to the poor, the welfare is going to increase, up to a point in which the poor are going to be already satisfied because they have already everything they want. And increasing more their transfer, it's going to be actually problematic for the country as a whole because you're going to be taking money out of the budget of the government that could be spent on, once again, hospitals and schools. So you're affecting everyone else that is not poor up to a point that like welfare is going to start decreasing. And also because the poor people are already satisfied, right? So what I show in my paper is that, if you, this derivative here, which is basically trying to capture how much welfare increases if you increase the transfer, is a function of the observed reported income. That's something we get from the data. The second one is the welfare weights, philosophical parameters. And the third one is an effect of changes in the transfers. So like that's basically kind of like this elasticity, right? It's kind of like how much people are going to start reporting less income if we increase the transfer by a little bit. So to give you a sense of how I solve this problem, I am showing you here the budget constraint of a household, a poor household in Brazil, which is the setting of my paper. So income here is in the horizontal axis, and income Y is just the product of wages, the hourly wage, and the number of hours of work. And the consumption is in the vertical axis. And the reason this is the budget constraint is because if you think about a household that earns a particular income, say this income here, this household is going to be able to consume no more than this income, right? Because that's the only source of money that they have. So that's why the budget constraint without a transfer program is just going to be 45-degree line, so that households can only consume what's below this line. Now, the anti-poverty program in Brazil gives some transfer to poor households that earn less than 70 reais, which is the Brazilian currency. So you see here that households are not only going to be able to consume their income, but also the benefits that they get from the income, which is a function of income. And therefore, for all these households that they earn less than 70 reais, they're going to be able to consume a little bit more than just their income. But once households are a little bit richer than 70 reais, they lose all their income and they get back to this their consumption not being any larger than their income. And if you think about the utility functions, for those of you that took microeconomics, the utility functions, the utilities of this household, the preferences of this household can be represented by different curves like this blue line. And the way to think about this is that because income is the product between wages and hourly wage, and to work more is costly from the point of view of the utility of the households, the more you work, the less happy you are. So like utility decreases this way. Now, the more consumption you have, as you go up in this graph, you're going to be earning, you're going to be happier, right? Because as we saw, consumption is utility is increasing consumption. Therefore, the utility is going to be increasing to the northwest of this graph, and the preferences can be represented by utility functions like this. Now, I'm showing here a particular indifference curve from a household that is maximizing its utility by choosing this particular income. So they are maximizing their utility here. But this household is indifferent between being in the program, working less and earning less, or being at this point where they earn more and they work more. Now, if there's a small reform in the program in which the government increases the transfer by a little bit and increases the threshold by a little bit, this household now is going to prefer to be inside of the program. So they're going to jump into the program because of that. So they are going to be basically reducing their income in order to join the program. And that's the precise nature of the reform that happened in Brazil, in which the transfers increased and the threshold increased. So I'm going to investigate this empirically, given that was the Brazilian reform, by looking at this fraction of households. So out of all the households that were updating from above 77, right, so from this region, until each month M, what's the fraction of households that are updated to this precise interval between 70 and 77, which is the interval that became attractive with the reform. So basically, I'm going to be seeing people start jumping into the program once the reform kicked in. So if I plot this fraction here of households jump into that precise interval, I see this graph. So this graph has the time in the horizontal axis, and then the share of households jumping from above 77, which is the share that I just discussed, over time. And the gray area here represents the months between the announcement of the reform and the enactment of the reform. And you see here the number of jumpers starts increasing drastically right after this reform. Now, the problem is that there could be alternative explanations for that. So Brazil, for instance, was going through an economic crisis, and it could be the case that households are decreasing their income to that particular interval just because of the economic crisis and not because of the reform. So in order to just see if this is the cause effect of the reform, what I do is that I plot the share of households updating to neighboring intervals, such as 77 and 84, 84, 91, 91, 98. So if you look back at this graph again, this intervals are around this part of the schedule, and this part of the schedule was not affected by the reform, right? But if this increase here was due to the economic crisis, you would expect people were also diminishing their income to this neighboring interval, so all of those other red lines would be increasing too. But that's not what you see. You see that those red lines are quite flat. So that under the identifying assumption that the share of households obtaining to 77 and 84 and 91 would remain parallel in the absence of the reform, we find that 0.7% of the households jump to the threshold because of the reform. That's the cause effect of the reform, right? So plugging into these numbers into my welfare analysis formula, this is what I find. I find that for each dollar spent with this household without children, this poor households without children, 66 cents went to these households that earned less than $70, right? So these households were households that were eligible before the program, and they just earned a little bit more income because of the increase in the transfer. 22 cents go to the households that are already between 70 and 77 before the reform. And those households, they got a big increase in transfer. And 22 cents out of this marginal dollar went to them. Now, 12 cents. Oh, and before I talk about the 12 cents, note that like for this two first effects here, that's kind of like the intended effect of the reform, right? Because the government wanted to increase the money given to the poor, and the government wanted to increase the number of people that they called eligible poor, right? So they wanted to include this household that earned between 70 and 77 reais. But the third effect is that 12 cents actually going to these households that were earning more than 77 reais, and they jump into the program because of the reform. And that's the unintended effect of the reform, right? Because the government didn't want people to stop working or report less income just because of the reform. But that actually happened, as we saw. So 12 cents is what we call the efficiency cost of the program. And the public policy implication is as follows. If the government prefers to transfer 88 cents to the poor, right? So that's 100% minus this 12% of efficiency cost. So they prefer to transfer 88 cents to the poor more than to have $1 extra in its budget spent with schools and hospitals, etc. The government should increase the transfer to the poor. That's kind of like the policy implication of this paper. Okay, finally, I also want to talk a little bit about another example, which is unemployment insurance. So that's another important policy in which the motivation is that workers face the risk of becoming unemployed, right? So the trade-off here is that an increase in the unemployment benefits increases the welfare of the unemployed, right? Like you feel safer upon unemployment, but it also increases the government expenditures, right? So the government will be spending more money as they transfer more money to the unemployed. And finally, there's also an incentive effect, which is the fact that if you give a lot of money to the unemployed, you could be discouraging work, right? Because people just, well, I mean, I'm going to get so much money unemployed, I prefer not to work and get that money. And the fact that people are going to become more unemployed, that's going to increase further the government expenditures. So you have like here the same graph in which welfare is in the vertical axis, the benefits to the unemployed in the horizontal axis. And you have the same effect in which as you increase the benefit out of zero, giving a little bit of money to the unemployed, you're going to increase a lot their utility because they're so miserable upon unemployment that giving them a little bit of money is going to increase their utility a lot. That's going to be great for welfare. But as you increase too much their benefits, they're already going to be satisfied with unemployment. And furthermore, if you increase more their benefits, you're going to start discouraging them to work so much that everyone's going to become unemployed, and then the government's going to have to spend less money with other policies such as schools and hospitals, and that's going to harm the welfare. So you see here the welfare start decreasing after a given point. So once again, you can determine the optimal benefit rate as a function of changes in the unemployment spell because of the benefits. So that's kind of like, as you increase the benefit, how much longer people stay in the unemployment, right? This length is what we call the unemployment spell. And the second one is the utility loss when becoming unemployed, right? So this is kind of like how much people are worse off whenever they're unemployed versus whenever they're employed. So David Card and others, they have studied this effect empirically in Austria. So this graph here shows the severance payment in Austria. So severance payment is basically the money that you get once you get fired by a job. And that's in some countries this is a lot, right? And in Austria in particular, there is this rule in which if you stay in your job up to 3 years, you get no severance payment. So there's no severance amount if you just stay in the jobs within 3 years. But if you spend more than 3 years in your job, then you want a couple of months of severance payment. And if you stay more than 5 years in your job, then you get more than 3 months of severance payment. That's kind of like the law in Austria. So what David Card is going to show is whether people spend more time unemployed whenever they get this severance payment. And here he's looking at this first cutoff here, right? That's 36 months. And so he's plotting here in the horizontal axis the previous job tenure, so how many months you spent in your previous job. And in the vertical axis here, he's showing the the mean of non-unemployment duration. So basically, how long people are staying unemployed right after this event of like being fired, right? And what he's doing here is that he's looking at a discontinuity that happens exactly at 36. And the reason why he's doing that is because if you think someone that stayed like 12 months in the previous job and someone that stayed 60 months in the previous job, those people are not very comparable, because this person here is probably a lot more resilient, was a better fit in the job and so on, whereas this person here was just like giving it a try and it didn't work out well. So they're different. But if you look at someone that stayed in the job just for 35 months and someone that stayed in the job for 36 months, those people are much more comparable, right? So if you just look at the difference around the discontinuity, this is actually just capturing the effect of the severance payment, which is kind of like really what you want to get, how much more people stay in unemployment upon getting this money. And you see here that there's a huge effect, right? So like there's like something like people that get the severance payment, they spend around 10 more days in unemployed after this severance payment. So then they're going to use this empirical evidence to inform the public policy, as we discussed before, but I'm not going to go over this because we don't have time. But that's just like showing another type of empirical work that you can do to get the cause effect of the reform, which is very important to inform these policies. So in the final part of this lecture, I want to talk about how we relax the rationality assumptions. And here, to do that, I'm going to discuss Social Security, which is a policy that is super important and super expensive for the government, which is the fact the government transfer money to the retirees in order to make them better off upon retirement. So the motivation is that workers throughout their life, they just don't save enough, right? So we saw that like during the Great Recession, that the people, they didn't save enough, and then they come to retirement and they are super poor, they cannot afford healthcare and so on. So the trade-off here is that as you increase the money given to the retirees, you increase their welfare, you increase their utility, but you also increase the government expenditures, right? But there's another problem with this particular policy, which is the following. Whenever the government is saying that like the workers don't save enough, it's almost like the government saying, I, as the government, know better than the worker how much the worker should save, right? So basically, the government is kind of like saying that the workers themselves do not know how to maximize their own utility. That's why we call it the paternalism problem, because it's paternal in the sense that the government is acting like a dad that says, I'm going to teach you how to be happy, right? You don't know how to make choices. I'm going to make these choices for you. And there are other examples for that in which the government does that. So, for instance, taxes over cigarettes and sodas kind of like have the same rationale, in which the government says, oh, you think you want to consume cigarettes and sodas as an individual, but actually you're over-consuming. So let me be your dad and teach you how to cut down these consumptions by increasing the prices over cigarettes and sodas. But this creates a big problem because if you think about all we were talking about up to this point, is that we have this assumption, this rationality assumption that the taxpayers, the individuals, they were making their choices to maximize their utility. And what the government is saying here is that they're not doing that. They are just maximizing wrong utility. So the challenge here is that if the choices we observe in the data, right, the choices from taxpayers and retirees, it's not informing the utility of these taxpayers and retirees, what would inform this utility, right? Like how we can make empirical work if the choices that we're observing the data are not showing to us what's the optimal policy. So to give a precise example, I'm going to go over a simple example, and then I'm going to go over the traditional solution that was the case until 2009, and then I'm going to give you like the cutting edge solution to this problem. So traditionally, what behavior economists would do is that they will look at choices of individuals. So let's say there's this guy called John that is choosing how much to save. So he's choosing whether he's going to save 0%, 10%, 20%, or 30% of his wage for retirement. And normally he chooses 10% over 20%, 20 over 30, and 30 over 0. But then he goes and visits his poor uncle, and upon like realizing the poor situation of his poor uncle that is retired and doesn't have a lot of money, he actually prefers to save 30% and 20%, 20% and 10%, and 10% and 0%. Now, the traditional solution was to impose a premise over this problem. So let's say that the premise, for instance, that John remembers the importance of preparing himself for retirement after this visit. In this case, because he actually learns about the importance after the visit, the choice that reveals his true utility is the one after the visit, because that's whenever he remembers this important feature of his economic choice. So the optimal choice for John in this case is actually 30%, because this is the one that is revealing his true utility. But the problem is that we can have a different premise in which John overestimates the importance of his future when visiting his uncle, right? So it's just like he gets confused whenever he visits his uncle, and then he thinks, oh my God, this is going to happen to me, and I'm going to be over worried about this. So it's actually like blurring his choices whenever he visits his uncle. And under this premise, the choice that reveals his true utility is the one before the visit. So under this premise, the optimal choice for him is actually to save 10% of his income for retirement. Now, the problem with this traditional approach is that we need premises on which choices represent John's true utility. And not only that, and like we as economists, we are not psychologists, right? We don't know what's going on in John's mind whenever he's making choices. And the problem about that is that different premises yield different results for the optimal policy. So that's a problem, right? So Burnham and Rangel, they have this very cool paper in the QG in 2009, in which they discussed some similar examples. And to give you an intuition of what's going on, of what they propose is that, let me go back to the same example in which John chooses how much to save between 0, 10, 20, and 30% of his wage for retirement. And normally he prefers to save 10% and 20, 20 and 30, 30 and 0. Then he goes visit his poor uncle and his choices reverts, right? Like he chooses 30 then 20, 20 then 10, and 10 to 0. Now, what Burnham and Rangel, they propose is that we inform John about his life expectancy, his expected income in each scenario. So like we're going to tell him like, look, you're expected to live up to this many years and your expected lifetime income is this one. So those are the important information for you. And then we go and let John make choices in each one of the scenarios. So like, let's say that normally he prefers to save 20 then 30, 30 then 10, and 10 then 0. And after visiting his poor uncle, he prefers to choose 30 then 20, 20 then 10, and 10 then 0. So you see here that because we gave him this information, he flipped this choice before visiting his poor uncle. Now, there's still like some inconsistency between what he does before and after what visiting his poor uncle. So that's kind of like leads you to the third step, which is that we conclude only that the optimal choice is either to save 20 or 30%. So see here that we're not going to give you like a precise optimal choice in contrast to what we've done before. We're just going to give you some range. Now, the big advantage of this method is that we don't need a premise, right? We're not saying which one of those choices is actually yielding is actually revealing the true utility of John. And that's a big advantage, right? Because we as economists, we don't have this capacity of read the mind of these folks. The second, but the advantage of here is that in contrast to the traditional method, we're not going to say what's the optimal choice. We're just going to say that the optimal choice falls within this range, right? So just to give you one quick evidence that this like rationality issues are important in the data, what I'm showing here is a graph from this paper by Medran and Shea, in which they look at the choices of individuals for saving to retirement. So as you probably know, in the US, there is this policy, the 401k, in which if you save money, if you put money on the 401k, your employer usually matches your money, right? So like, let's say I put 6% of my income in 401k, the firm that I work for, could put something like 3% or 6% of my income to match that. So it's almost like I'm getting free money. It's like a very big incentives for people to save. But what we're showing here in the green line is, so this particular firm used to have a policy in which you would have to opt in order to get this 401k savings account. So you'd have to sign up into that yourself up to a given year. But then after a given year, all the employees that joined the firm that year onwards, they start being automatically enrolled in the 401k. So the green line here is showing like what's the percentage of the employees that actually sign up for 401k over time before the automatic enrollment. And you see here, the proportion starts at 20% and goes all the way to 60%. But then after the automatic enrollment was implemented, you see that this proportion goes to 80%. But nothing is changing in terms of the policy, right? Like the government is still matching, the employer is still matching the same amount of money before and after the automatic enrollment. So if you think about the individuals that are making this choice to maximize their utility, this automatic enrollment shouldn't affect the choices. It's really affecting because people are not very rational whenever they make their choices, right? They sometimes just go with the flow, and they're not making an actual utility maximization choice. And that's kind of like a place where you see that in the data. Okay, so to wrap up, I think I hope what we learned today is that there's a big trend to guide public policy with data. Public economics offers these very cool tools, right? The sufficient statistic method to guide these policies. But there are a couple of limitations, and I want to be upfront about that. The first one is kind of like, what is the welfare weight? This is a philosophical question, and it's out of the scope of economics, in my opinion. But the second one is that if there is no rationality, the policy is not going to be precisely determined, right? As we saw in the case of John, we're just going to put some balance on what the optimal policy looks like, but without knowing exactly how much, what we should do. But I still think that this is the best guide to this debate on all these policies that we have available. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity to share. So thanks again, Ali, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks so much.